June 17, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The morning mist clung to the Bavarian countryside like a shroud, but at 27,000 feet above the Reich's industrial heartland, the air was crystal clear and bone-numbingly cold at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Major Robert Lucky Rosenthal gripped the control yoke of his B-17F Flying Fortress, Memphis Belle II, as 230 American bombers carved contrails across the German sky in the largest daylight raid yet attempted over the Third Reich. What began as Boeing's Model 299 in 1935 had evolved into something the German High Command never anticipated, a four-engine fortress that could absorb punishment, that would destroy any other aircraft and still complete its mission. The B-17's nickname wasn't marketing hyperbole. It was earned through blood, aluminum, and an almost supernatural ability to bring its crews home against impossible odds. In the cramped cockpit, Rosenthal's breath formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask as he maintained formation with the 91st Bomb Group. Behind him, 9 other crew members occupied their battle stations in the aircraft's aluminum tube, each man knowing that their survival depended on the Flying Fortress living up to its legendary reputation. The B-17G model they flew represented the pinnacle of American heavy bomber design. 74 feet of wingspan, carrying up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance defended by 13 50-caliber machine guns that could unleash 850 rounds per minute of devastating firepower. 25,000 feet below, Oberst Adolf Galland, the youngest general in the Luftwaffe at 31, stood in the operations bunker at Yevor Airfield, watching the radar plots with growing concern. The American bombers were flying in what they called combat box formations, a defensive arrangement that created overlapping fields of fire so dense that approaching fighters faced a wall of lead. "Mein Gott," Galland muttered to his aide, studying the scope. "They're flying fortresses indeed." The numbers told a sobering story. Each B-17 carried 2,500 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition distributed across its defensive positions. A typical combat box of 18 bombers could theoretically fire 45,000 rounds per minute, enough firepower to shred any fighter that dared approach within effective range. German pilots had learned to respect this aerial porcupine the hard way, with Luftwaffe losses mounting steadily as American bomber formations grew larger and more sophisticated. But what made the B-17 truly formidable wasn't just its defensive armament. It was the aircraft's almost supernatural ability to absorb battle damage and continue flying. Built by Boeing with redundant systems and a robust airframe design, the Flying Fortress could lose engines, suffer massive structural damage, and still limp home. Stories circulated through both Allied and Axis air forces of B-17s, landing with holes large enough to walk through, missing tail sections, or flying on 2 engines when 4 had started the mission. Staff Sergeant Tommy Morrison crouched behind his 50-caliber machine gun in the ball turret beneath Memphis Belle II, scanning the sky for the telltale glint of German fighters. At 19, the farm boy from Iowa had already survived 12 missions over occupied Europe, each one a 6-hour dance with death at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe without assistance. The Sperry ball turret was perhaps the most vulnerable position on the aircraft, a glass and aluminum sphere suspended beneath the bomber's belly, offering an unobstructed view of the earth below and any fighters approaching from underneath. Morrison's intercom crackled with the voice of Technical Sergeant Jake Eyes Kowalski from the top turret. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high. Focke-Wulf 190s coming in fast." The distinctive silhouette of German fighters appeared as dark specks against the blue sky, growing rapidly larger as they closed the distance at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. What the German pilots didn't know, what no one outside a handful of Allied intelligence officers knew, was that the B-17s flying over Schweinfurt that day carried a secret that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the European air war. Hidden within the standard bomb load of each Flying Fortress were experimental proximity-fused shells, a revolutionary technology that would detonate automatically when passing near a target, eliminating the need for precise timing or direct hits. Hauptmann Klaus Mietusch, leading a squadron of FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 26, had shot down 72 Allied aircraft in 3 years of combat. He knew the American bombers' weaknesses, approach from directly ahead where their defensive fire was lightest, aim for the cockpit or engines, and break away before the formation's combined firepower could track his fighter. At 400 miles per hour, he had perhaps 3 seconds to line up his shot and fire before physics and geometry forced him to dive away or risk collision. But as Mitusha's fighter closed to 800 yards, optimal firing range for his 420mm cannons, something unprecedented happened. The experimental shells from Morrison's ball turret began detonating in proximity to his aircraft, creating a deadly cloud of shrapnel that no pilot could anticipate or evade. The Focke-Wulf 190, pride of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, shuddered as metal fragments tore through its engine cowling and cockpit. "Scheisse!" Mitusch shouted into his radio as his fighter began trailing black smoke. The proximity shells were exploding all around the attacking German formation, turning the previously predictable geometry of aerial combat into a lethal lottery. Within minutes, 3 FW-190s were spiraling earthward, their pilots either dead or struggling with damaged aircraft that could no longer maintain formation. The technological revolution represented by the B-17 extended far beyond its defensive capabilities. Each flying fortress cost $238,320 to manufacture in 1943, equivalent to approximately $3.8 million in today's currency. Boeing's Seattle plant could produce one B-17 every 90 minutes at peak production, a manufacturing miracle that German industry, despite its reputation for engineering excellence, could never match. The Luftwaffe's best fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, cost 180,000 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly $720,000 in modern terms, but German factories could barely maintain production of 300 aircraft per month while American plants were delivering 650 heavy bombers monthly by mid-1943. Below the aerial battle, Greta Hoffmann pressed her face against the cellar window of her family's farmhouse outside Schweinfurt, watching the contrails etch geometric patterns across the morning sky. At 16, she had lived through 4 years of war, but the sight of American bombers flying in broad daylight over the German heartland still seemed impossible. Her father, a veteran of the Great War, had assured her that the Reich's air defenses would never allow enemy aircraft to penetrate so deeply into German territory. The sound reached her first, a deep rhythmic thrumming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines per aircraft, each producing 1,200 horsepower, created a mechanical symphony that could be heard for miles. 230 bombers meant 920 engines generating over 1 million horsepower combined, enough to power a small city. The psychological impact on German civilians was as devastating as any bomb. If American aircraft could fly unopposed over the Reich in broad daylight, what did that say about the Luftwaffe's ability to protect the fatherland? Greta's diary entry that evening would capture the moment's significance. "Today I saw the future flying overhead. The Americans came in the morning light, and our fighters could not stop them. Papa says the war will be over by Christmas, but he no longer says which Christmas." Back at 27,000 feet, Major Rosenthal fought to maintain formation as his aircraft bucked and shuddered from the concussion of nearby flak bursts. German anti-aircraft artillery, the dreaded 88s, could reach their altitude with deadly accuracy, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke that marked the explosion of 80mm shells. Each burst created a lethal sphere of shrapnel 100 feet in diameter, capable of downing any aircraft unlucky enough to be caught within its radius. But the B-17's robust construction meant that even direct hits didn't guarantee a kill. The aircraft's self-sealing fuel tanks, armored crew positions, and redundant control systems allowed it to absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Technical Sergeant Bill "Mac" McCready, the flight engineer, monitored engine temperatures and fuel consumption from his position behind the pilots, ready to compensate for battle damage by adjusting power settings and fuel flow. "Number 3 engine's running hot," McCready reported over the intercom as a piece of flak punched through the engine cowling. "Oil pressure's dropping, but she's still turning." The Wright Cyclone engine, despite losing oil and running above normal temperature, continued producing power. A testament to American engineering and the robust design philosophy that prioritized reliability over maximum performance. What German intelligence didn't realize, what would only become clear in post-war analysis, was that the B-17's true strategic impact lay not in its individual capabilities, but in its role as the centerpiece of a revolutionary approach to strategic bombing. The Americans had developed what they called daylight precision bombing, using the Norden bomb site to target specific industrial facilities rather than simply dropping ordnance on cities. Each B-17 carried a Norden site worth $8,000, more expensive than most automobiles, capable of theoretical accuracy within 75 feet from 20,000 feet altitude. The target that day, Schweinfurt's ball bearing factories, produced 60% of Germany's anti-friction bearings, components essential for everything from aircraft engines to tank transmissions. Destroying these facilities would create cascading effects throughout German war production, potentially crippling the Reich's ability to maintain its military machine. The Americans had identified what modern strategists would call a critical node, a single point of failure that could collapse an entire system. Sergeant Morrison, still tracking targets from his ball turret, watched German fighters reforming for another attack. The Luftwaffe pilots were brave, suicidally brave, but they were fighting a losing battle against mathematics and industrial capacity. For every German fighter shot down, the Reich lost an irreplaceable pilot with months or years of training. American bomber crews, while equally valuable, could be replaced more easily thanks to the massive training programs operating across the United States. The numbers were stark. Germany graduated approximately 2,400 new pilots annually, while American flight training schools produced over 100,000 aircrew members per year. Each B-17 crew represented 440 hours of specialized training, but the United States could afford those losses in ways that Germany simply could not. The Luftwaffe was fighting a war of attrition it could never win. Oberst Galland, monitoring the battle from his command bunker, understood the strategic implications better than most German officers. "We are watching the death of the Luftwaffe," he confided to his operations officer as radar plots showed German fighters breaking off their attacks. "These American bombers are not just aircraft. They are flying symbols of industrial might we cannot match." The proximity-fused shells were proving devastatingly effective against German fighters, but their true significance lay in what they represented: American technological innovation applied to warfare with ruthless efficiency. While German scientists pursued exotic weapons like jet fighters and rocket planes, American engineers focused on incremental improvements that could be mass-produced and deployed immediately. The proximity fuse was elegant in its simplicity, a miniature radar system that detonated explosive shells when they passed near a target, dramatically increasing hit probability against fast-moving fighters. As Memphis Belle II approached the initial point, the navigation checkpoint where bombers would begin their final approach to the target, Major Rosenthal felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that preceded every bomb run. The next 10 minutes would determine whether 230 aircraft and 2,300 American aircrew would successfully complete their mission or become statistics in the growing ledger of aerial warfare. "Bomb bay doors open," announced Lieutenant Charlie Tex Henderson, the bombardier, as he hunched over his Norden bomb site in the aircraft's glass nose. The mechanical precision of the site, combined with Henderson's training and experience, would theoretically allow him to place bombs within a 500-foot circle from 4 miles above the target. In practice, factors like wind, flak, and evasive maneuvering reduced accuracy significantly, but the principle remained sound. Daylight precision bombing could achieve strategic effects impossible with nighttime area attacks. The ball-bearing factories below represented more than industrial targets. They were symbols of German technological prowess and economic organization. Destroying them would demonstrate that no target within the Reich was safe from American air power, a psychological blow that might prove as significant as the physical damage. German civilians, watching their supposedly impregnable homeland violated by enemy aircraft in broad daylight, would begin to question whether the war could actually be won. What no one in the formation knew, what wouldn't be discovered until post-war intelligence analysis, was that German engineers had already begun dispersing ball-bearing production to smaller facilities throughout occupied Europe. The Schweinfurt raid, while tactically successful, would have less strategic impact than planners hoped. But the demonstration of American air power's reach and precision would resonate far beyond the immediate military effects. Technical Sergeant Morrison, still scanning for fighters from his ball turret, noticed something that made his blood run cold. Far below, barely visible against the German countryside, a new type of aircraft was climbing toward the bomber formation. The Messerschmitt Me-262, Germany's revolutionary jet fighter, could climb to 25,000 feet in 6 minutes and attack at speeds approaching 540 miles per hour, fast enough to make conventional defensive tactics obsolete. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered into his intercom. We got jets coming up from 6 o'clock low. The appearance of German jet fighters represented a technological leap that could potentially neutralize the B-17's defensive advantages. Jets could approach too fast for gunners to track effectively and attack from angles that conventional fighters couldn't achieve. But the Me-262s climbing toward the American formation carried their own fatal flaw. Fuel consumption so high that they could remain airborne for barely 90 minutes, and engines so temperamental that many failed to reach operational altitude. German technology was advancing faster than German manufacturing could support, creating weapons that were individually superior but strategically irrelevant due to their limited numbers and reliability problems. Major Rosenthal watched the jets approach with professional interest rather than panic. Intelligence briefings had prepared B-17 crews for this possibility, and tactics had been developed to counter the new threat. The key was maintaining tight formation discipline. Jets might be fast, but they still had to slow down to attack accurately, and during those vulnerable seconds, concentrated defensive fire could still bring them down. The mathematical reality of aerial combat remained unchanged despite technological advances. Hitting a target required precise timing, accurate aim, and sufficient time to line up the shot. Jets compressed the time available but didn't eliminate the fundamental requirements of marksmanship. American gunners, trained on skeet ranges and aerial gunnery schools, understood lead angles and deflection shooting as well as any pilots in the world. Lieutenant Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom. 2 minutes to target. Bomb bay doors are open. Bomb sight is tracking. The Norden sight, mechanical marvel of American precision engineering, was automatically calculating wind drift, altitude, and airspeed to determine the precise moment for bomb release. Henderson's job was to keep the crosshairs centered on the target while the sight's gyroscopes and gears performed calculations that would have required a team of mathematicians using slide rules. Below, air raid sirens wailed across Schweinfurt as German civilians sought shelter in basements and bunkers. Greta Hoffmann huddled with her family in their cellar, listening to the approaching thunder of 920 aircraft engines. The sound was unlike anything in human experience, a mechanical roar that seemed to shake the earth itself and announce the arrival of industrial warfare in its purest form. The psychological impact on German morale was incalculable. Citizens who had been told that the Luftwaffe was invincible were watching American bombers fly unopposed over their homes in broad daylight. The Reich's propaganda machine would struggle to explain how enemy aircraft could penetrate German airspace so easily, and civilian confidence in ultimate victory would begin its irreversible decline. What German civilians couldn't know was that the B-17 formations overhead represented just the beginning of American air power's assault on the Reich. By war's end, the United States would deploy over 12,000 heavy bombers in Europe, dropping 1.5 million tons of ordnance on German targets. The Flying Fortress, initially designed as a coastal defense aircraft, had evolved into the primary weapon of strategic bombing, a tool for destroying an enemy's ability to wage war by targeting the industrial infrastructure that supported military operations. Staff Sergeant Kowalski, manning the top turret, tracked one of the approaching Me-262s through his gun sight. The jet was approaching from 2 o'clock high at a speed that made conventional gunnery techniques nearly useless. But Kowalski had learned to lead fast targets during training in Nevada, and he understood that even jets had to follow predictable flight paths when setting up attack runs. Got him lined up, Kowalski muttered, squeezing the trigger of his twin .50 caliber machine guns. The weapons fired 850 rounds per minute each, sending a stream of armor-piercing incendiary bullets toward the approaching jet. The Me-262 pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Schall, saw the tracers arcing toward his aircraft and rolled into a steep dive to avoid the defensive fire. The engagement lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it illustrated the fundamental challenge facing German jet pilots. Their speed advantage was offset by reduced maneuverability, and the need to approach within range of concentrated defensive fire. American gunners might not be able to track jets effectively, but they could still fill the sky with enough lead to make attack runs extremely hazardous. "Bombs away!" Lieutenant Henderson announced as the Norden site automatically released 8,000 pounds of high-explosive ordnance toward the ball-bearing factories below. The B-17 lurched upward as 4 tons of bombs fell away, and Major Rosenthal immediately began a gentle turn to the left to clear the target area and rejoin the formation for the long flight back to England. The bombs fell for 45 seconds before impacting the Schweinfurt industrial complex in a series of explosions that could be seen from 30 miles away. Each 500-pound general-purpose bomb created a crater 25 feet in diameter and destroyed everything within a 100-foot radius. The cumulative effect of 1,140 bombs, 230 aircraft carrying 8 bombs each, was devastation on a scale that German civil defense had never contemplated. But the true measure of the B-17's strategic impact wasn't visible in the immediate destruction below. The Flying Fortress had demonstrated that American air power could reach any target within the Reich, attack with precision during daylight hours, and return to base despite determined German resistance. This capability would force fundamental changes in German strategy, requiring the diversion of resources from offensive operations to homeland defense. The statistics told the story of transformation. Before the B-17 offensive began in earnest, Germany allocated 12% of its military production to air defense. By 1944, that figure would rise to 33%, representing a massive diversion of resources from tanks, submarines, and other offensive weapons to anti-aircraft guns, fighter aircraft, and radar systems needed to counter the American bombing campaign. As the bomber formation turned for home, Technical Sergeant Morrison rotated his ball turret to scan for pursuing fighters. The German jets had broken off their attacks, either due to fuel limitations or the concentrated defensive fire from the bomber formation. Conventional fighters were still visible in the distance, but they seemed reluctant to press home attacks against the bristling defensive armament of the combat boxes. The flight back to England would take 3 hours, during which German fighters would make sporadic attacks, and flak batteries would fire at extreme range. But the most dangerous part of the mission was over, and the B-17s had once again demonstrated their ability to penetrate deep into German territory, deliver their ordnance with precision, and fight their way home despite determined opposition. Major Rosenthal checked his fuel gauges and engine instruments, noting that all 4 Wright Cyclones were running normally despite the flak damage to No. 3 engine. The B-17's robust construction and redundant systems had once again proven their worth, allowing the aircraft to complete its mission even after sustaining battle damage that would have downed less sturdy aircraft. What made this particular mission historically significant wasn't just the tactical success of destroying the ball-bearing factories. It was the demonstration that American industrial might, applied systematically to the problem of strategic bombing, could achieve effects that no previous Air Force had imagined possible. The B-17 Flying Fortress had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of American technological and industrial superiority that German propaganda could no longer credibly deny. The numbers were stark and undeniable. American factories were producing heavy bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Even accounting for combat losses, the 8th Air Force was growing stronger each month while German fighter strength steadily declined due to pilot losses and fuel shortages. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with greater industrial capacity, and by 1943, American production advantages were becoming overwhelming. Oberst Galland, watching the American formation disappear toward the west, understood that he was witnessing a turning point in the air war over Europe. "Today marks the beginning of the end," he told his aide. "We can still win individual battles, but we are losing the war of production. Every B-17 that returns to England will fly again tomorrow, while every fighter we lose takes a trained pilot with it." The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate military effects. German civilians, watching American bombers operate with apparent impunity over their homeland, would begin to question whether the war could actually be won. Morale, that intangible but crucial factor in any nation's ability to sustain a prolonged conflict, was beginning its irreversible decline. As Memphis Belle II crossed the English Channel 3 hours later, Major Rosenthal reflected on the mission's significance. They had lost 14 bombers and 140 aircrew members, a heavy price by any measure. But they had also demonstrated that no target within the German Reich was beyond the reach of American air power, and that the B-17 Flying Fortress could deliver that power with a precision and reliability that would ultimately prove decisive. The aircraft that had begun as Boeing's Model 299 in 1935 had evolved into something its designers never envisioned, a strategic weapon capable of destroying an enemy's ability to wage war by systematically dismantling the industrial infrastructure that supported military operations. The Flying Fortress had become the primary instrument of American air power, and its success would reshape the nature of warfare itself. Technical Sergeant Morrison, finally able to relax as the English coast appeared below, understood that he had participated in something historically significant. The B-17 had proven that strategic bombing could achieve effects previously possible only through ground invasion and occupation. Air power alone might not win wars, but it could certainly make them unwinnable for the enemy. The post-mission statistics would tell the story of transformation. German ball-bearing production dropped by 67% following the Schweinfurt raids, forcing the Reich to implement emergency measures that diverted resources from offensive weapons to defensive systems. More importantly, the psychological impact on German morale was devastating. If American bombers could attack the industrial heartland in broad daylight, what hope remained for ultimate victory? But the true legacy of the B-17 Flying Fortress extended beyond its immediate military impact. The aircraft had demonstrated that American industrial capacity, properly organized and directed, could produce weapon systems in quantities that no enemy could match. The Flying Fortress was more than a bomber. It was proof that democratic societies could mobilize their resources more effectively than totalitarian regimes when faced with existential threats. The lesson transcended the specific circumstances of World War II. Technological superiority combined with industrial capacity creates military advantages that individual heroism and tactical brilliance cannot overcome. The B-17 had become the symbol of American air power not because it was the most advanced aircraft of its era, but because it could be produced in quantities that made strategic bombing campaigns possible. As the surviving bombers touched down at their bases across England that evening, ground crews would begin the process of repairing battle damage, refueling aircraft, and loading ordnance for the next day's mission. The B-17 Flying Fortress had become the backbone of a strategic bombing campaign that would ultimately help bring the Third Reich to its knees, not through individual acts of heroism, but through the systematic application of industrial warfare on a scale the world had never seen. In the end, the Flying Fortress had earned its nickname through blood, aluminum, and an almost supernatural ability to bring its crews home against impossible odds, proving that in modern warfare, the side with superior industrial capacity and technological innovation will ultimately prevail, regardless of individual courage or tactical brilliance.